Welcome to another episode of Dev by Design. Today, as you can see, we have a wonderful guest. This is my friend Karl. Karl, you want to go ahead and do a quick introduction? Tell us just a little bit about who you are, what you do, why you're here.
Sure thing. Yeah. So I'm Karl. I'm a product design lead at a company called Moneybox in the UK. But I also look after design in my kind of downtime at a headless CMS company called Cosmic. And I guess, I'm a bit of a design developer hybrid. So I've kind of come from a world of tinkering and development, which maybe we'll get into, and then slowly evolved into a sort of design pathway. And then I've kind of found myself in this weird intersection, as people like to say, everyone's favorite word, the intersection of design and technology. But I'm kind of in this space now of designing and developing and trying to use both skills to make each other better. If that makes sense.
I was so interested in having you on when we first chatted, especially because I work in a very similar role. I also consider myself that kind of hybrid designer developer, but I started on the design side and then moved over into development, and you kind of went the other way around. So I'm curious to hear a little bit about what first got you interested in design and kind of how you started to learn and what that transition was like.
So I've got a very weird background, actually, if we dig into it properly. So I've always been creative. Ever since I was super small, I've been kind of interested in patterns. So like whether that's logical patterns or creative patterns, finding a pattern in something's been kind of this red thread. And I think it's only in like later years looking back, maybe we all do this, I don't know, but you can kind of draw some conclusions, right? You can look at things and be like, oh, okay, I see how this all sorts of starts to ladder up into
it all starts to click together.
Maybe I'm making stuff up that didn't actually happen, I don't know. But the way that I remember it is being very small, I used to love Lego. It was like a big thing for me. So I'd always construct these little blocks and shapes and patterns and got really obsessed with that. And as I got older and had the opportunity, I started to get involved in doing a lot of woodwork with my grandfather. And so I learned about this importance, or this kind of obsession with craft and care and building stuff and really thinking about how it's made, but also how, like, the attention to detail you can pay to the finished article. So like the kind of end result. So I just loved this process, this logical process. And as I got older, I got really interested in how that applied to fine art and went down a pathway of fine art. So very kind of traditional painting. I went to university and studied fine art, got a degree in fine art, did a master's in fine art. But the whole kind of way through that journey, I was tinkering with technology because there was something that kind of just, I don't know, it interested me in that space. And I think the thing that triggered it for me was the MySpace era. So I'm a MySpace child, right? This is like prime. So 2005 to 2007-ish was like this key era. And I started seeing people with MySpace profiles that looked amazing. And I was like, how are you doing this? This isn't what MySpace looks like. You know, it's like these weird blue and orange boxes. Like, I want this cool thing.
Yes.
And so I'd like be hunting around trying to figure out what's going on. Anyway, find out later down the line, you can just write HTML and inline styles into any text field in any part of MySpace, save it, and it would override. And I was like, where's this magic? And so I got really obsessed with like the kind of MySpace modding, I guess. And that led me down this path of like super loving this like high level creative, sort of very expressive fine art degree, and then quietly in the background being super interested in like that low level technology, like how do you mod stuff in that space. So I was like, these two things together feel like they can belong together, but we're just pulling two different ends of the spectrum, right?
Yes.
And so I ended up going down like a work pathway of not being in anything creative. I was an account manager for quite a while, and then slowly fell in love with this notion of UX and thinking about the experience for a customer. And that was where I started to be able to put the two things together more in my mind, was like understanding the process, understanding what a customer needs, but then also thinking about how you could then present it back to them. And so I started to get that kind of connection. And then, I guess I sort of, that path found me towards eventually being a product designer, but I've always kept this development skill and kind of fascination, I guess, as part of my career. So a little bit whistle stop, a little bit long. I don't know. That's my background. It's a bit weird.
No, I think it's good. I think a lot of folks in tech have, and maybe I think more folks in tech than we think do, have this kind of hybrid background. It's not always design development, but so many of us did not actually come from like a strict computer sciences course in college right into a, engineering role, and we've never done anything else. I think those kinds of varied backgrounds actually really help and can bring a lot. It certainly informed my approach to development, and I know it's informed yours. So I think it's...
Yeah, and I would say it's a super key thing that I look for when I'm hiring as well. So if I'm hiring a designer, I'll be looking for designers that come from slightly more obscure backgrounds, because, I got given that chance. So I'm like, cool, I want to pay that forwards to other people. But also there's just something really valuable in that. Like you say, we at Moneybox, we have designers who've come from more of a like marketing background. We have some that have come from like motion graphics. And so each of those are like incredibly useful skills to bring into the design practice. And the same is true of our engineers. We have people who were designers that turned to engineering and kind of gone through that pathway. You've got back-end coders who have become front-end people. You've got front-end people who have gone to back-end, and so and all those skills become valuable in some way. And I think, you're at a good company when they can nurture that and embrace it, rather than looking strictly at, your CV doesn't show that correct path, so therefore you're not, the person we're looking for.
Yep, absolutely agreed. I also love this comment that we got from Aaron. It says HTML and CSS is magic. Back when you were talking about the MySpace era, like
it's so good.
I think a lot of us have that. And there's so much you could do with just HTML and CSS. I feel like, especially like I live on the front end, so there's a lot of, you get dragged down the rabbit hole of frameworks and React versus Angular versus Vue versus Svelte, but there's so much cool stuff you can do just HTML and CSS. So
it's always going to stick around, right?
That's true.
The advantage there.
You become a master of HTML and CSS, you are set.
I think it's the logical place, right? It's where most people will start, and it's the kind of it's that foundational work that really pays off in the end. And especially in that design development hybrid area, it's like that is the front end. That's the stuff that people are going to be interacting with. And to be honest, like JavaScript was kind of this really complicated thing for years in my head. Like I just couldn't comprehend what it meant and how it worked and what it was for. And so I played with HTML, CSS for probably the majority of my time understanding development. It was only in probably about 4 or 5 years ago that I actually even first tried messing around with a bit of JavaScript and playing with jQuery and kind of being like, I don't even understand this. But it's like an abstraction, but it's still confusing me. And then I've kind of got deeper and deeper into things over the years. And Vue was actually the way that I managed to finally click with JavaScript, interestingly.
Okay. Nice.
Because of the way you structure pages, it's at least in Vue 2, you had that nice big HTML template, and then you just sprinkled the JavaScript on, but it always felt like it was in a way that was very, I don't know, like HTML centric, rather than like being very JavaScript heavy. So like React, for example, it's all just JavaScript wrapping the JSX, right? And and so my head couldn't make sense of it. I was like, why am I writing HTML inside of a return statement? Like, I don't get this. And like in later life now, like I'm actually using Next and React and actually really enjoying it because I understand how it works. But when I was trying to get into it, it was like this complete black box of just,
Yeah.
I don't know what this is meant to do.
That is something that I both love and hate about React, is it really just throws everything in one place, and it's like, Godspeed. Like, for a couple of years I swapped over and wrote Angular, and they're very intentional about kind of separating the templates, you know, and the HTML structure from the JavaScript. And I was like, all right, I guess. But I learned React first, where everything is just
oh yeah, you went the other way.
I went the other way.
I think it's good though. Yeah. Like, and understanding vanilla JavaScript obviously is super useful, and being able to play in web components and all of that stuff is great, but it obviously requires a lot more work because there's no abstraction layers. But in terms of knowing the foundations, at least it's the useful.
Right place to start. I think you can do it the other way around, but I think it gets harder.
It took me a long time for sure.
But what about now? Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're kind of doing for work these days, now that you've kind of landed at the end of this transitional period, and kind of what your day looks like now?
Yeah. So I guess kind of day to day, like 9 till 5:30, the usual hours. I work at a company called Moneybox. So we're a financial app, a financial savings app that kind of aims at helping people do more with their money. So we're trying to help people save for later life and think about kind of how do you invest money, but in a way that is kind of low friction and accessible for everybody. And it's a super interesting product. It's a product that I used as a customer from the very early days, actually, when they first were kind of kicking around. So having the opportunity to then move and work there has been super interesting. And there, day to day, I'm a full-time product designer. So the main focus of my day is thinking about the customer and building the actual design. So looking at flows, thinking about research, trying to kind of construct great products, great features. But I also look after our design system. And so by looking after that, you kind of inadvertently have to understand the coding counterpart. And so although the kind of day-to-day role doesn't include much development work, I do bits and pieces here and there, but mostly it's design. Where I'm kind of flexing that dev brain is in thinking more holistically about how we build and construct a true design system and how we make that system work across Android and iOS. Because we use both platforms natively, we don't have a cross-platform hybrid.
That is
so we're not working with Flutter, we're not working with like React Native. It's pure. So we've got Jetpack Compose on the Android side, and we've got Swift on the iOS side. So using it all officially, but that also adds complexity. And for our design team in general, as I said, we've got diverse backgrounds. So we have people from marketing, motion graphics. You've got more traditional designers from traditional design backgrounds. But generally speaking, we don't have an expectation that a designer will understand the more complicated side of how things are built. And so I kind of take on that, that leadership role there, but also that mentorship opportunity of trying to upskill where I can the team. And I've got a fantastic colleague who works with me on the design system, and she's very, very kind of hot on wanting to learn this stuff. So I spend most of my day officially designing for our investing product, but then in most of my kind of spare time within the day, I'll be working on the system, trying to construct a better system, better components, and then most importantly, actually the big part of that role is the advocacy piece internally. So looking at working with engineers in both those teams, Android and iOS, and trying to kind of, be this glue between those teams, trying to keep us as this one kind of holistic system. And that's probably the toughest part. And it's not because none of us want to make it work.
It's just a challenging problem.
So hard, yeah. And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that design systems are still, I think although companies know that it's a good thing to invest in, it's still never going to be something that's invested in at the same level as, features that are going to bring money into the business ultimately. And so I think a lot of my job as well is working with stakeholders to kind of talk about the importance of a good design system and why actually that is a money maker. It's just, there's not an immediate money like coming in from the work, but it's that consistency and that experience. You drive down internal costs by focusing on the system. So got to have that budget brain on, which is gonna get a bit tough.
It's a whole different brain.
It's the one that I'm still working on.
All right, I'm going to take just a moment to say hello to Thindle. Welcome back. I'm glad that you are here. I also love this greeting. I hope you're having the day you deserve, which feels, I'm going to go ahead and say, almost borderline petty in a good way that I'm enjoying. I'm from the southern United States, and it has a very like bless your heart energy that I'm here for.
Interesting. I like
hope
it.
You're having the day you deserve. Yeah, I didn't know. I know you meant it in a great way, but I still had a little laugh at it personally when I saw it pop up. But yes.
I hope you are too as well. I think we all hope each other are having the day we deserve.
Yeah. Just a bit cheeky. Yeah, that's a good word. Cheeky's a good word. That's exactly what I meant. But bouncing off that, there were like 3 different things that you said while you were talking about that I wanted to ask you a little bit more about. So I'm going to try and think through and work my way. One of the things was definitely you talked about kind of mentoring some of the designers who didn't have that exposure to the dev side. And I'm curious where you found that they kind of struggle. Maybe struggle is not the right word. Where they're lacking that kind of knowledge and where you can help fill in some gaps. Where would you identify from the design side that the dev design gap is happening?
I think one of the biggest ones that comes up, I think, is like, and this is super understandable as well when you think back to how design has kind of come to where we are. So I'll kind of go back on a bit of historical stuff around design tooling. Because it will help to clarify this point. But like, obviously in the early days of building UI, there was only so much available to you in terms of software. And so obviously most designers will have started out building UI in Photoshop because that was kind of the tool that
I remember those days. Yeah. Dark days.
every designer of past started in Photoshop designing posters and things like that, usually band artwork. That was my origin story, that stuff. And then you kind of get to this point where everyone starts making these mobile apps and it's this new thing, and then suddenly like, oh, we need to design these. How do we design them? So everyone is like, we use Photoshop for everything else, so let's use Photoshop. Now, problem with Photoshop is it's pixel based, and so therefore everyone designed for fixed screen sizes, right? So it's like, this thing is 320 pixels wide, and so I'm designing at 320 pixels 1x, and that's it. Great. And so everything that got built exactly pixel perfect. And so everything was like, okay, you've done this thing 48 pixels, it's always going to be that. Let's just build it 48 pixels, done. Now, obviously, over the years, software's moved along from a design perspective. You had Sketch, which obviously came and broke things completely apart from where Photoshop was. And then we had obviously Figma come in, and Adobe XD, which is now kind of not really a thing because of the Figma thing. Adobe buying Figma.
But it was for a minute. Yeah,
it was for a minute.
Like,
it tried.
Sketch,
it tried.
Adobe XD era.
Vision Studio, yeah. That was actually way ahead of its time. It was a great piece of software. It's just a bit buggy. But I mean, so this whole thing happened, and suddenly we had vector products, so Sketch and Figma and co. Now you didn't have to think about fixed sizing. You could think more kind of holistically about what is the UI on the screen, and then we can design these additional sizes, or we can export at different resolutions, and everything kind of works. Great.
Yeah.
Now the challenge is when you take designers who have come either from the Photoshop background or just have that kind of mindset or that history, and you bring them to a space of like building responsive products. So even obviously we know the responsive web exists, and that's been around for quite some time, but even these days with phone sizes changing all the time, like mobile apps can't be static sizes. They need to have responsive areas And you look at any of the good guidelines when you're building like an iOS app, for example, you've got these adaptive screen sizes that need to be accounted for, so that you're not building every viewport size. You're just building one screen and it adapts. Right?
You'd die having to build out. Even if you were building only for iPhone, if you had to build out for every iPhone size, you'd still want to jump off a bridge. Good Lord.
Android, I don't think you'd even be able to figure out what all the sizes are. It's just so varied. But so I think what ended up happening is I remember when I first joined at Moneybox, we do this product review process. So when a design's been built, the engineers and product managers will share that work with the designers and say, hey guys, like before we ship it, can you review it and make sure you're comfortable with how it looks, right? Great. And then what we started seeing was that certain designers, because they have that mindset and they're very conscious about it being perfect, and I'm here for it, because like that is the right head to have on. But the problem would be that, the guys would be maybe designing an iPhone 8 size because we were designing for a slightly constrained viewport, and then they'd be reviewing on an iPhone 10. And so now it's like, okay, well, if we haven't designed that screen in iPhone 10 format, there's going to be some variance because there'll be more white space or spacing between elements. So what we were seeing was that like we get to this review stage and it's like, oh no, I was expecting the word to wrap exactly in this way, but it's not wrapping the way that I designed it. And it's because obviously we don't want to force wrap it, because then you'd have potentially, these two components that are miles apart on a larger device. And so that was kind of one of the first points where I was like, this is an area where I can start to offer some support and some mentorship and start to advise and explain, why we wouldn't want to do that, right? Why we need to maybe accept that things won't wrap the same way. And so how do we make our design flexible enough and good enough that if it doesn't wrap, we're still happy with the way it looks? And so you'd have things like everyone's favorite, like widows and orphans, which is like a design thing. I don't know how comfortable we are with those, but widows and orphans being characters or words that are left either at the start of a block of text or at the end of a block of text, and they're just on their own, hanging around. And in print, we can be really conscious of that and say, okay, cool, I'm designing, building something for an A4 page. So I'm going to constrain the type in a certain way that it definitely doesn't leave a widow or an orphan.
Right.
Cool.
And it doesn't move, so you don't have to worry about it. It's printed and it's done. It looks the same way every single time, no matter how many times you print that page out.
And yet we get the complete opposite in this new responsive mobile world. And so again, it's like, having that opportunity to talk to them and get them comfortable with like, you're going to have some of those, and it's fine. Like, the best you can do is add some more text if you really want to. You could fluff up the copy a bit more, but I don't think it's worth it, right? It's not a piece of art in the same way, right? It's not like this finite, like print is, once it's done, it's done. You've got the object is finished. This is a fluid piece of work, and so it's getting comfortable with that too, I think. But yeah, I mean, that was the kind of biggest first one, and then obviously there's many more around just thinking deeply about how you design a component to be built. But I think we can dig into that in a minute because I've got an example.
There was one other thing that I wanted to ask you about before we dive in. I know you've got some live examples, and I definitely want to look at those because they are awesome. But the one other thing that I wanted to touch on was that you talked a little bit about the idea of kind of getting support and buy-in internally around design systems, kind of convincing people of their value, or possibly just doing some educating on what a design system is and what it includes. I'd like to hear a little bit more about kind of how you approach that in your workplace, because it seems like it's been successful. You're on the other side now. You've got a design system that's being well maintained, and it sounds like it's been, well adopted and is well used. So, but was it always that way? Did you kind of come into a place where the culture was
Definitely not. Not for lack of trying, and not because nobody wanted it, right? I think it's it was an interesting journey. So we were using Sketch originally when I joined, and we had a Sketch design system, but in actual fact what we had was a Sketch UI kit, right? It was a bunch of components that had been considered. We were reusing a good portion of them. But what I found when I joined was that our engineering team were rebuilding those components every time they built a screen. Oh. And so if we had the same exact component used across multiple views, they'd be rebuilding it in the moment when that screen came up. And so we ended up with some inconsistencies there, because, you know, a designer might have taken the sketch symbol, detached it because it wasn't quite doing what they wanted, and then slightly adjusting it, and then something breaks or like changes, and we've suddenly got 24 pixel padding on the bottom of this thing that's meant to be 16 all the way around. You know, or just spacing slightly different, like 12 pixel between things instead of 16. And these little inconsistencies would then get coded in. And so then you'd come to build a new screen that uses that same component, and then they'd build it again and again and again. And so we just had this huge amount of waste happening. So that was the first thing I noticed. The second thing was this, what I touched on first, which is we had a UI kit. So what we truly had was, we were calling it a design system, so it feels like we had one. But the truth was, we didn't have a system. We just had a bunch of components in design. And so a friend of mine, actually, Louis from Figma, he talks about this a lot, and I'm of the same mindset, which is one of the biggest problems with design systems is the word design, because it gets conflated with it being a designer responsibility and a designer asset, right? Yeah. So that's why when people have a UI kit and they label it a design system, they feel like that's what it is. They're like, oh yeah, I've got a design system. But you don't. You've got a bunch of components, and that's good. Like, that is absolutely where you need to start.
That's part of a design system.
It's not a system until the engineers have got the same things, and you know exactly how to use it, and you can communicate how it should be used. So that was the big piece for me, where it was like, there's a huge amount of work that needs to happen around how do we get buy-in to turn this system into a system. And so the first thing that I ended up doing was looking at recruitment internally. So didn't have, as I said, like, this design system role is something that I've just kind of taken on. It's not a formal part of my day-to-day always. Like, I can dedicate time to it, but it's not, 50% of my time is design systems. It wasn't in the
job description when you were hired.
Exactly. Yeah. And so what I ended up doing was just looking internally and chatting with some engineers and kind of having some very open discussions about what could we do. And it just so happened that the Android team were in this like early stage thinking around converting from typical XML views into using Jetpack Compose. So they were thinking about, we want to modularize, we want to componentize. Then when I was chatting with the iOS team, they're talking to me saying, hey, look, we've been working with Objective-C. We want to move towards Swift. We want to kind of try and modularize. We've been using storyboards, but now we want to go towards actual programmatic UI building. And I was just like, in my mind, I'm sat there going, this is the time, right? If I'm going to do it, this is my moment, because these two teams are already thinking about these shifts. Why don't we just all shift together? Yeah. And so we basically all came together as a unit. We got representatives from each team and sat down and said, right, how do we do this? And right in the middle of this as well, helpfully, I decided we were shifting to Figma and got the buy-in to do that. So I was like, okay, I'm going to have to rebuild this UI kit. So why don't we rebuild the UI kit with this new world in mind? And so we basically just put a bunch of time in, and we still have regular sessions every week, or every 2 weeks, I think it is, where we sit down with those engineers and we say, cool, what's the next component on the list? And then we'll look at a core component and we'll have a chat and be like, how can we build this better in design? How are you going to actually implement this? And then how can we kind of reverse engineer your thinking into how we design it, so that when I say we're going to use button, we're all like, cool, I know exactly what button is, I know what properties it has, and I know what to expect. And so when there's a button on screen that someone's designed that doesn't fit criteria that we've laid out, they've broken away from the system. And why? And then we know that's going to extend build time. And then do we want to improve our component for everybody based on that one change, or do we just do it once? It starts to open up a lot more discussion. And it also meant that we could open up this, discussion and this work around actually documenting usage and trying to be a bit more rigid and serious around, like, how as design do we guarantee that we're using our components in the right way. And so we've kind of ended up having to put a lot of responsibility onto our designers that maybe they didn't have before, around like looking at the system and thinking before like rushing to design screens, like looking back at the system and thinking like, hey, what do I actually need for this screen? If I need a list of information, I should probably use a list row. And so am I going to recreate a list row every time? Well, that's kind of a waste of time, right? So I'll go to the component and I'll use that. And if that's not fit for purpose, what I try to do is put the challenge back on them and say, why isn't that component fit for purpose? What's missing? And then if we feel that what's missing is valid and, can't be solved by either using a different component or by, removing whatever that blocker is and just using the existing one, then we will consider potentially evolving that component and trying to take it forward to the next level. So it's kind of opened up a lot more discussion. And I think as we've started to do this and as we've started to build those components and use those components when we construct screens from both a design and engineering perspective, other teams are starting to see the benefit. And so what we're experiencing is like, hey, look how much quicker we shipped that screen this time round because we reused like 80% of this because it's all components. And so we're seeing that pay off a little bit, but it's still far from a complete system. We've I think probably only got 12 solid components that are actually perfectly matching across all platforms. So it's still very early days, but it's going good.
But it's a process. I mean, like you said, that kind of stuff takes a lot of time and resources and commitment, and just getting everyone on board is in and of itself a huge accomplishment.
Wow. Yeah, I'm just grateful for the people that I work with. I think it'd be a lot harder if there wasn't people in other teams that were keen, right? I think it's when you've got an uphill battle that it becomes very difficult. But I was just very fortunate. The right people at the right place. We were in the right place as a business, the right size, the right kind of things were happening, and had the right management and the right team behind me that were able to kind of empower me to push it forward. So it all paid off.
Nice. So you brought with you some examples, correct? And some things to share with the class.
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead.
Do you have some stuff?
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and add your screen share here. And you can kind of walk us through what you got for us, which is, I've seen it. I've heard about it. I know it's cool. But
I hope so. Okay. So as I said, Moneybox is my day-to-day role. And then in my down hours, I work with an amazing team, a very small, nimble team, a company called Cosmic. So Cosmic was actually the first headless CMS back in the day, when WordPress was the dominant CMS of choice. So Cosmic kind of broke apart that idea and thought more about the data being this kind of object that could live outside of the front end, and you could then just feed it to any front end. And obviously now there's tons of CMSs out there, and a lot of headless CMSs that are doing great things. But I've been using Cosmic for quite a while, I think 2.5 years, probably 3 years nearly, to power all of my web projects. And I ended up having a chat with the CEO one time by replying to a no reply email at one point, and it
so
just
there
all
are
happened to
people
work
on
out.
the other ends of those. They always say there's not,
yeah.
but you cracked the code.
It was like an intercom auto message thing. And so I ended up replying to it, and then we got chatting, and he was like, "Oh, you're a designer that is using a CMS. That's interesting. Like, talk to me about Cosmic." And we had some chats, and then I was like, hey, I think we could improve some stuff here for my own selfish benefit. And he was like, cool, well, why don't you just try designing some stuff? Like, what would you think? I was like, okay. So I helped with like a article, blog post header, I think, first. And then secretly in the background was like, if I could redesign the UI, what would I do? And like did like 3 screens or something, and then sent it to him. He was like, okay, cool, let's do this. So, and that was like two and a bit years ago. And now, yeah, I've been kind of working with the team, like I said, in my off hours, just any spare time I have, just completely redesigning the entire CMS, which was quite a feat.
That's a task.
And then, yeah, also started working on the all the marketing pages now as well, which is pretty fun. That's kind of a bit of a different pace, but yeah, this has kind of worked out really well. Going back to that like origin story of the designer developer, like in both bits, logical, creative, blah blah blah. Like this plays to that really well for me, because it was a tool I was using. It was something that I understood from a technical perspective to some degree, because I was using it to power my own personal websites. But then I was like, okay, cool. Like, it's a very different challenge than trying to design that product, because it's like it already existed. So I don't want to start from nothing. Right. So you kind of like, I was kind of skinning it. And then as we skinned it, we looked at opportunities to improve it. But one of the super useful parts of this is it exists, as I said, which means we have these objects in real world. Like we know what returns from the API in different places. And so what I like to do is kind of use that to my advantage. And I do this at Moneybox too, but I thought I'd show the Cosmic stuff because I can get a bit more involved in both sides at Cosmic, because I do some of the front end coding, little bits, but also Moneybox being financial is kind of a bit more sensitive, whereas this is a CMS, so we can be more free.
Yes.
But yeah, so I guess, yeah, what am I showing here? Let me kind of dig into this. So this is a little process that I like to do. I've been doing it more recently. I didn't used to do this, but I started thinking about like when I'm designing a screen, like I need to understand what data exists to power that screen. Obviously I could just guess, or wing it and be like, what do I want to show on here? But
a long and noble tradition of design is just guessing.
Winging it. Yes. And again, it goes back to that, like if you don't understand how it works, then how are you supposed to truly design for it? Because you kind of need to have that basic knowledge of what this thing is doing so that you know what you can work with. And this is where this got kind of interesting, because as I said, this stuff existed already. And the same is true of Moneybox, where more often than not, at least, before I started trying to practice this process, we would be designing the APIs in kind of semi-isolation. So the API is happening over this way, and then the designer is working over this way, and they're kind of overlapping, but the designer isn't aware of what's happening in the API. And same with the kind of like that back end isn't necessarily seeing the front end and making those two tie up always. And so what I started doing was bringing those engineers into sessions at the very beginning and saying, like, if you guys are thinking about it, let's map the API together, because we can map, like we can look at what we want this API to return, and then we can look at what we want the screen to do, and we can see where the gaps are and where the opportunities are, So in this example, like I've got this this project. It's very empty in this example, so apologies, but we've got this like empty projects page, right? It's got one project in it, and so there's like quite a lot of things being returned here. I've not shown everything, but even just for this card, like when it came to designing the card, rather than me just being like, oh, I want to have a title and a description and a tag and some other things, it's like, okay, let's find out what's already being returned here, and see if anything's useful, and then we can always extend the API if we want to add new stuff. And so I just like fetch the actual response for projects, because I can get that right. I can just dig into the inspector and see what's coming back. And I saw that, cool. All right, we get a title, we get a description, we get this plan. and we also get the total buckets, total users. Well, they're all things that are kind of useful. I get these other metadata, so like created by, created at, modified at. Do I want any of that? Probably not. It's not like super useful. I mean, I might want to, and at least I know now as well, at a later date, if I suddenly decide, hey, actually, if I'm on a team, it might be really useful for other team members to see when this was last modified. Actually, that's making me think maybe that would be useful. There you go, real time. But I know that's already being returned. So actually, from a kind of designer builder perspective, I know like, okay, we're already getting that data. So actually it's just a front end thing where I'm just saying, okay, I just want to display a string. We've already got the data, show it too. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So from a planning perspective, it also becomes really helpful to understand what you're mapping against, because you can be like, cool, that's a small job, like guys, and selfishly as well, from a designer perspective, I think sometimes in different organizations it varies, but sometimes I've worked in places where developers don't necessarily always want to do something, and so we'll make it seem like it's kind of hard. So it can help knowing if it is relevant.
It's a good way to call other devs out on their BS. Yes. Be like, no, I know that's already being returned. I just need you to throw another paragraph tag in here. Yeah.
I'm kind of bad about it, but it's the same though for designers, right? No one wants more work.
Everyone's done it. Oh, I know designers. I know. I've done the same thing where it's like, ooh, I don't know. Like, we don't have a component for that. And you're just like hiding the UI kit behind some stuff. Like, no, that's going to be at least 15 hours of work.
What do you mean you want to modify that? 6 months? Done.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, it's helpful for that, but I think more than anything, like I said, it's helpful for kind of exposing things that, like just now, right? I genuinely hadn't thought about maybe a modified like date might be useful, but no, I know this comes back now, so maybe I can make that change. Great. But then also simple things like this. So like if I'm returning the user, like all I want is the avatar here. Mm-hmm. But I know that in order to get the avatar, we actually get all of these other pieces of information because we're returning the entire user object. And that's because that avatar is also a button that allows you to get into the account details, etc. So like it's useful to have that information up front. But that means I know I can expose some of these other things if I want to. So for example, I can expose the name at the top level, or I could expose the email address at the top level. There's all this kind of information that maybe I wouldn't have thought about. Last login date as well, right? May be useful in this particular context. So it kind of starts to perform this great useful exercise as a designer. But also, if, I've been able to go and do this ahead of sharing this design with the engineers. And so it also becomes a really useful tool when I go and talk to them about building this page. I can be like, guys, like, this is what I'm thinking. We've already got these data. This is what we're getting back. This is how I'm thinking it maps. Like, cool. And they might turn to me and say, hey, like, it's dumb. Don't return the whole like user object here. I feel that's overkill. Like, why don't we drill down? We'll just return the avatar at this stage. We don't need the rest. I don't know. So it kind of opens up all those opportunities. And yeah, I guess it's proved to be a really useful exercise. We do this a lot more, like I said, at Moneybox now as well. And it's also kind of a great exercise if you're in a team like I am with Android and iOS developers, where you've got two very different ways of developing front end. They're both working with the same backend team, and they're writing stuff in C# as far as I know, which is cool. But like having those teams in those sessions and talking about how we're going to map the API to the UI in real time with all those people, I feel like there's just something about that journey that helps to unblock all of the teams very early on, rather than getting to the point where it's like, I suddenly think, oh man, we started building this, but actually the modified data would be super useful. And I put it in the design, and everyone's like freaking out, you know, oh, we've got to rethink the whole API now. And instead we can be like, nope, already there. Like, all we've got to do is just decode that UTC timecode. Cool, let's just do that. Right, great. Which is always fun, right? Yeah, that I guess is the long and short of that process. So I've been doing a lot more of that. And also I've just done an example here as well, which I can, you know, it's a bit more detailed, but this one is more specific around how I think about mapping when I'm building a component. But I guess, do you want to chat about the other stuff first before I dig into this, or should I just keep flying away?
There was one thing I was going to ask, which is a couple times now you've talked a little bit about trying to manage but like people who are writing in different languages, right? The iOS group and the Android group. And I'm really curious, I'd like to hear a little bit more, I guess, about how you're mitigating some of those, right? Because you've added a whole nother layer of, like, I would almost call it like translation, right? You're already, we talk about teams that struggle all the time just moving from design to development. That is in and of itself its own translation. We've been talking a lot about that. You've added an extra layer, right? In that you're not just translating to one language, you're really translating to two and trying to keep things consistent across them both and unified within the system. I'm curious kind of what the struggles have been that you've encountered and how you're managing that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it was probably a lot harder initially. So when, as I was saying previously, when I first joined, we were using XML views for Android. So like the traditional way of building an Android app in using Java, and then having a storyboard Objective-C, or maybe they were using Swift, but just storyboards actually for iOS. So iOS were kind of, if people aren't familiar with storyboards, iOS were essentially creating the app using Xcode's kind of design tool, I guess. So storyboards is like a visual way of constructing code. So you're dragging and dropping like an input field, and then you can style that input field. It's kind of like a visual editor, and then you just hook it up in the way that you want to certain APIs and you know, flows and all of this stuff. But you're basically building it like it's a kind of a design. Android doing it the old way, XML, that stuff, very different process altogether. XML super complicated to reuse, because you essentially all you can do is just copy and paste, and that's like not a great experience. So they're like, you know, I want to reuse this component. It's like hunting through a screen, like a bunch of XML, trying to like copy and paste it. I mean, maybe there's better ways, but they were just like in a bit of a mental place with it. And so we had these two very different ways of building apps. But both of them were being driven by the same design team, who weren't designing specifically for iOS or Android. We were designing kind of, so we tend to design for iOS first, not for any particular reason than iOS was the first app we released.
Gotcha.
So we didn't have Android for quite a while afterwards. So in the early days, that was how it was built. And so that practice has just kind of sort of spread through the company, I guess. And so we just haven't bothered to change. So what we do is we design at iOS. Once that's agreed and signed off, we then duplicate those designs, switch out the iOS components for the Android ones, and then make any modifications where we need to. So from a design standpoint, it's not so bad. We have specific Android components when we need them. We have specific iOS ones when we need them. And then we've got this kind of middle ground, which is just custom components that we've designed that are kind of cross-platform. So when I rebuilt the design system, I very kind of strategically and specifically split our system up so that we didn't think about these shared components as iOS and Android. So originally when we had the UI kit, we had an iOS kit and an Android kit, and they had all the same components in, right? So you had the specific ones, and then you had the non-specific shared stuff, but they were being duplicated. And so what would happen is we change an iOS one and forget to update the Android version.
I was literally just thinking maintaining those documents sounds like a nightmare. And then Yes.
So you'd open an Android screen and you'd have tons of iOS components in there. It's like, wait, what? And so like, it wasn't so bad because visually, it looked fine. But the reality was that was where I saw that kind of really initial crack. So when we switched to Figma, we could have done this in Sketch. It was just, it happened. I thought I'd tie it all up. So when we switched to Figma, I ended up sitting down with my design system colleague, and I said to her, like, we're going to audit this whole system, and we're going to look at every component that is shared. And if it's shared, it's going in a shared bucket. If it's specific, it's going in a specific bucket. And so we split everything up. So we were like, iOS, Android, shared. And what we found was that shared library was like 3 times the size of the 2 specific libraries. And it was like, that showed immediately, like, the opportunity for failure was huge. And that was what we were witnessing. As Aaron says here, that makes sense. Shared and specialized. Exactly. Right. It's being specific. And it made a huge difference because it becomes more maintainable, to your point, around the kind of difficulties there. But also it meant that we could be very clear and upfront with those teams that, these Android ones, these you've got, like, these are just your native components. Same for the iOS team. So all we're doing is slightly styling them, but you should have all of that stuff. The rest of it, those are the ones we know we need to build now. We need to sit down and we need to start thinking about how we build them. And so once we kind of pulled those resources together, had that little kind of ad hoc design systems team that's all just doing it as a labor of love, I guess, at this point, we knew that we could work together to think about the best way to build. And I guess looping it all the way back to the original question around how you manage it, because of this switch that's happened where Android have moved to Jetpack Compose, the modern way of building for Android, and iOS have moved to programmatic Swift, what we've seen, although we can't go quite as far as Swift UI yet, because we haven't got quite enough compatibility yet to be able to do it. Once we do, Jetpack Compose and Swift UI are almost identical in how they construct views, how they think about views. And like, I guess, with like web frameworks these days, they've become closer and closer and closer to the same paradigm of how they construct stuff. And so what it's actually enabled is those conversations have become far easier, because when we talk about constructing a button with specific props, like, we can all look at it and go, cool, okay, yeah, so we know a button can have like a left and a right icon, no problem. We'll label them the same thing. We can have an optional text label in there. We can programmatically control the border radius, etc., etc. But we know that we can do it in the same way. We can declare the props in the same way across all of our systems, including Figma now, because of component properties, which is what I'll show you in a minute. But it just ties it all up.
No, just agreeing. Like, I feel like every time Figma rolls out something new, it's like, oh my God, that's exactly what I needed. I didn't know. They're the masters of solving that. You always hear the, like, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses kind of thing in design. For those of you that don't know, I believe that's actually not a real quote.
It wasn't. I remember hearing this. There was it was a misquote, or there's like someone just made it up and then
I feel like someone just made it up. For a long time, it was attributed to Henry Ford, right, the creator of the modern kind of automobile. And I don't think he's actually said that, but it's a really good design line. It's really true. For a fake quote, it's really accurate. But
no, I mean, the Figma team are doing an amazing job, and
killing it.
I get to see it not firsthand, but I know some people there, and they I know how hard they're working on trying to because like, you're trying to take a design tool and make it do more like a coding tool would do, but you don't want to go too far, because then you alienate designers that don't understand the coding part. And so you end up in this horrible loop of trying to make it more like how you build it, but with layers of abstraction that make it accessible. And so, like, for example, design tokens, It's something they've been talking about for ages. It's something that Figma is working on. They've talked about it openly, but making it work beyond the current styles implementation and making it work so that it's easy for a designer to use, but also does map to how a developer would build it. It's a really hard challenge to solve, but they're trying. So
yes,
we'll get closer. But yeah, on the subject of properties. So I've got this this cosmic button. So this is again for the cosmic project I was talking about. So this was basically, this was a component that I designed before we built it. So this is like an opposite effect. So what I ended up doing was just trying to think more about what do I need? So typical design process, everyone's different, I guess. So I am of the mind, most of the time I'll mock a single screen and then be like, cool, do I like any of this? If I like certain stuff, I'll be like, cool, I'm going to componentize that element so that I can reuse it, especially something like a button. So like, I may as well componentize that pretty early.
Right. There's some stuff that you know right away. Yeah, your cards, your buttons, some of that stuff, it's going to end up being a component. You might as well tackle it, abstract it from the beginning.
Exactly. And, you know, for a lot of people, there's like kits out there, shout out to Kendo UI, but there are kits out there already that, you know, have done a lot of the hard work of building those components and thinking about those abstractions for you, for both designers and developers, of course. In this case, we wanted to go fully custom, so we built everything from scratch. And that was mostly just because I wanted to have fun doing all of it. I wanted the challenge and the problem of trying to do it.
Yeah.
So we built this button component here. And originally the way it was built was basically, it was before component props. So I had 20 variants of a button with all the different states and possible variations of a left button, a right button. You can never have a left and a right button, but I had both in there because I kind of needed them, and so it was kind of awkward. But maybe I'd want two buttons with two icons on the button. I don't know. So I was just like, I may as well just have that as a variant because I don't know what might crop up.
Yeah.
So I was kind of like playing around with it like that, and it was fine. But then once props came in, I wanted to experiment with it and thought, you know, this is kind of this perfect opportunity to take that dual brain and be like, how would I want to build this? And therefore, how should I design it? And we'd kind of already built it, but I didn't want to like use that as a reference. I was like, okay, let's just pretend it doesn't exist as a React component. And I'm just gonna think about how I would design it.
If you get to start totally fresh. Yeah,
because we can always go back and refactor. It's fine.
Yeah.
So what I ended up with was this we've got on the right here. So there's a lot of debates around the best processes around like when it comes to having primary, secondary, tertiary buttons. You know, do you have them as a single like master component? I know that for example, the material design team have one big button component, and you have like a type property that you can switch for primary, secondary, tertiary. That's how I used to have it. I've since decided, for kind of simplicity's sake and maintenance sake, that I've actually split it into subcomponents because the secondary, tertiary buttons, for example, may not have all the same properties as the primary button. And so I didn't want to have like a lot of noise. So for example, our primary button here it only ever has a filled background, but secondary buttons, we have two states, so we can have a filled secondary or we can have an outlined secondary depending on what surface they're on. Yeah. And so like I didn't want that noise in the primary button because it doesn't need a bordered state. So it's
but it's a lot to remember as a developer, right? Trying to, you know, when you get to the point where you've got so many props and you're trying to remember like, okay, I need to do it in just this way and this works with this, but I can't have an outline button that also has whatever. And
well, and then, and what you end up with
load can be a nightmare.
You can end up with like a primary button that does have a border. And it's like, well, that wasn't in the design. It's like, oh, whoops, you know, I just left it in like by mistake, or like I enable, you know, put true on the border prop by mistake in the component, and like, you know, and that's not that big of a deal. But when you're talking about much bigger, much more complex components, you know, you just start to add risk, and this is a way of de-risking that, I guess, to some degree. So what we ended up with was this. So like in code, it's called the cosmic button because it's cosmic blue, which is fine. I'm cool with it. I didn't name it.
Cute.
I would have called it primary button for consistency. But hey, you know, I mean, I could go and rename it, but I don't want to mess everyone up. But yeah, you can see we've got all the same properties. So we have a state property, a label property, an icon left, and an icon right. So state, label, icon left, icon right. Well, hey, isn't it a dream? So yeah, we can pass it the state. So we can obviously have things like default, hovered, disabled, etc. If it's disabled, we've got the props for that. So different click rules, etc. And then, we've got all of these same flexible elements. So I know that if I tweak, again, it's super obvious for a button, but again, extrapolate out to complex stuff. As a designer, I can look at this set of properties in this panel and I know I'm allowed to edit this label because it's here, and I can click in there and I can edit that text. So that's and I always, I don't know, it's hard to come across in the right way about it sometimes, but as someone who maintains a design system, and this is especially true at Moneybox, where we've got a lot of moving parts, we've got a lot more designers. There's always a risk that if you don't expose the properties as a kind of almost a form of that documentation, so pretend the documentation doesn't exist and no one's reading it because they're too busy.
Which is 50% of the time correct. It's always probably good to assume like someone has not read the documentation.
90%, 100%. Yeah. No, it's true. Like it happens, and that's just the nature of working anyway. You have to move quickly sometimes. And so what I sort of treat this as almost is your approved list of like what you can do to this component. Which also helps for when new designers join a team, you can make it easier for them to pick these things up. Obviously the same for engineering, right? It's true of that if you've got a component that isn't clear about this, what it's able to do, for example, I've seen this before where there's loads of different props being passed into a component that are just not used, and you're like, okay, should they be used? Can they be used? Were they ever used? Maybe one time you had an additional prop for, I don't know, error, but you never used it. And so you just left it in the component, you didn't take it out. And so someone will be like, can I use that? And then they might start adding this error prop into the component, and then suddenly everything's broken or confused, and it creates that risk. And again, thinking away from button, thinking to more complex components, especially when you're passing state and data around, there's just a lot more risk there. And so what I like to do, is use this as your proof list. And so for example, the great thing about component props is if a bool is false, it hides the element that can kind of be triggered by it. So I've got these set up so that this icon left is a layer property that allows me to say, is this layer visible? So if this layer isn't visible, like the icon right, then any associated properties for that, so the instance swap, for example, here, where I can change the particular icon that's being used, gets hidden. And so I know that thing is just inactive, not being used. So
I'm going to interrupt real quick for just 2 seconds to say good morning to C#. I believe we may have been rated because I watched our viewers go way up. So I'm guessing Mr. Fritz just ended his stream and jumped over here. If so, thank you. For those of us that may have just joined, welcome. This is Dev by Design on the Code It Live channel, where we talk about basically design for a developer audience. Today we have my friend Karl on talking about kind of bridging that design development gap. And right now we are taking a look at kind of the idea of mapping, thinking about your API and mapping between that and your Figma properties to try and kind of bridge that gap and make sure that what's being created on the design side is matching one-to-one with what the actual development situation looks like. And correct me if I tried to sum up everything we've been talking about for an hour in like 5 seconds, and I know I've glossed over a lot, but just to catch up folks who might have jumped in. And yeah. Oh, nice. A session introducing .NET MAUI and Visual Studio. So we're talking about something completely different. I hope you're ready for a tone shift. But
nice.
But I'm glad you're here. Sorry. Keep on going, Karl. I didn't mean to cut you off there.
That's all good.
Say hello and welcome.
Welcome indeed. Yeah. So I guess, I mean, that's kind of the long and short of that. And I guess this process allows us, as I said, to be a lot more efficient and kind of reduce, hopefully, the chance kind of for errors and challenges along the way. And also, I think I kind of touched on this a lot earlier when I first started talking about the design system work, but at Moneybox, when we started this new process of trying to kind of bring these teams together and think more in a component structured way, I made it very clear to our developers, you know, it's called a design system, okay, same problem again, but it doesn't mean that design has to dictate everything about this component and how these things should work. And in fact, actually, I'd rather it be this shared experience and that it be a collaborative experience, because what ends up happening is we build a much more powerful, much better design component by thinking about it in a developer way. So to go back to the original example with this button. So when I first created it, I created it with the mindset of like, I just need like all these different versions of a primary button that I quickly switch between. And so I just made a single button component, did all the permutations, highlighted them, grouped it, and turned it into a variant set. And it's like, cool, okay, so I've got 20 variants of this button, and that works, and I can just switch through it, and it's all cool, right? I understand it as a designer because I made it, and it's great. But the problem was, like, A, it wasn't flexible enough. B, you had this like weird overlapping, like I was talking about, where you have borders on buttons that don't have them. So you toggle the border and it would change to a different button type because the primary button doesn't have a border. So suddenly it'd be a secondary button. And it's like, wait, what?
Right.
And we had like a bunch of things like that where toggling a certain state would flick other ones off and switch you to a different type of button. And it just got messy. And the same was true of the Moneybox design system when we built that. We had these variant sets that were in principle way better than what we had previously, which was just a single button component that you had to know what you could modify on. But it wasn't as usable. And so once we sat down with the engineers and talked about how they were planning on building it in this new world when they reconstructed the buttons, because we did the software shift, it was a great opportunity for us to do a kind of a reverse process and look back at that design component and say, can this be better? And the truth is, absolutely, it can be better. So like, let's make it better, right? Like, it makes perfect sense for us to do that.
Right.
And so we sat down and as a team, we mapped out, you know, okay, what properties do you have on your button? And this, again, to that point previously around iOS and Android teams being different, this also gave them an opportunity to be like, wait, what? Like, you're passing what? Okay, you've got a label and this like icon coming in, but we've only got icon. Like, you know, should we have the label as well? Maybe we should. So like, you know, they use it as an opportunity to align not only on how the components are constructed, but also to improve their interpretation of it, because, you know, maybe in iOS they always hard coded something like the label, whereas in Android they thought about it more programmatically, etc. So we kind of just found that once we got the rhythm right, we all made each other better as a team. And so it's this kind of like dream state where, you know, you're just kind of one team. And I think that's why a lot of bigger orgs are kind of shifting gears towards this notion of a design systems team, which is just like a kind of super team built out of, you know, combination of designers and engineers and other stakeholders that kind of can influence each other and kind of work towards this holistic greater good. And yeah, I mean, I'm here for it. Let's just keep it going.
Very much so. On that note, for folks that are developers on their team and are maybe interested in getting involved with the design system, or maybe they don't have one at all, right? I think kind of as you mentioned the name, by calling it a design system, right? On one hand, like you said, it makes it sound like it's the designer's responsibility. And I think the other thing that it can do that's not great is that it kind of scares people off, right? From feeling like, yeah, not only is it not my responsibility, you know, it's not my business, or I'm not qualified to participate in this or to use it to, you know, designers only. But that's very clearly not the truth. So for developers,
100%.
Yeah, for developers that are looking to either, you know, dip their toe in this if it already exists at their company, or maybe start up something completely new, do you have any tips for them?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is showing interest. I think like when we were trying to figure it out at Moneybox, like the advantage that I had was those people that had that kind of like, oh, okay, so how are you guys like managing it in design? You know, just asking open questions. Or, you know, when coming to build and construct those views, looking at like, oh, hey, I've noticed you've used this like button here. So like, actually, great example. I can do it in real time here. Let me switch to the old Kendo kit because I've got it open. But like, let's say if I'm a developer and I'm like looking at a screen and I see this like list component, for example, in Figma, let me just scale this with some like epic keyboard shortcut. There we go. Yeah, maybe that's a bit bigger.
Maybe even a couple more. It's always, it'll feel silly on your screen, and that'll mean it's like just readable for the rest of us. Yeah. Thanks.
Nice. So basically, as a developer, you'll be on this like inspection mode, and so you'll see. In fact, I shrink it. Yeah, there we go. So you'll see like the name of the component that's listed here. And one of the most important thing is, and this is only if you're using Figma, obviously every design tool is different. So, but most places are using Figma these days. So you can see that you get this like diamond shape. So what this means is this is a variant inside of a component set. So if I click on this big containing border, you get these like 4 little diamonds. So when you come to like inspect a design that's in Figma, you'll see this. So straight away, you know, this is like being used from a design system. So obviously we're thinking like, I'm actually in the system here, but like if we were in a particular view that was, you know, if I was to pull this out, if I was using this as an instance outside of here in my new screen that I'm building, you'll see here, look, little outline diamonds, that's an instance, and you can see there's this component button, which is a parent component, so you can go back to that if you need to. And also you can see, importantly, component properties, which tells you these different states or things that can change. One of the things that we kind of spied that was a real opportunity was when engineers would kind of almost critique the design before they went to build it, right? It's very, again, to the point around like design system being a design word, and potentially, you know, I don't think designers as a team have always done ourselves the best favors in terms of coming across as approachable sometimes. I think we can, you know, we can be a bit difficult and a bit perfectionist about stuff that maybe doesn't deserve it. But one thing that you can do as a developer is to start to look for those opportunities where things maybe aren't a component and start to ask questions, you know, in a nice way. So if I was to take this new, you know, say I've got 2 and I've disconnected this from the design system now, and let's say I've got like a group of these together. So you can see like I go over one of them, it's got a purple border, I've got one that's blue. Purple is the component instance. Blue just means it's just like a random frame with some stuff in it. But immediately, if I click on these 2 on the right-hand side, I've got very different outputs. So the component shows me these properties and things that I know are important. Whereas if I go on this separated one, I've got none of that. So, yeah, I can go and make this. I can inspect all of these bits and construct it. But the reality is what I've got here is not part of the system. So if this then changes at a global level, this one's not changing. So if I come back to rebuild the screen, it could look completely different. This one might be completely, split. I don't know, maybe we've decided suddenly that we're going to right align some stuff. I don't know. I can't break it because there we go. Let's do that.
There we go.
So yeah, maybe we've shifted all of these and they're going to be right aligned, but the one that was disconnected from the system is still left aligned. Oh dear. And that's a problem. It's bad for the designer, but it's bad for engineers. And so one of the things that proved really useful for us when we were trying to build this team out was certain engineers would come to the designers and spot these things and flag them and be really upfront with us and say, hey, I'm just building your screen for you, but I've noticed this is not part of a component. Why? Very openly, we'll look back at the design and be like, oh yeah, I had
good question.
I had 2 hours to put this together for you, and I was kind of hacking around. I'm real sorry. But what it ended up doing is it would show, it helped me to notice the people that were clearly keen to try and have some kind of a system. So I was like, these are the people I need to talk to separately. But for the other designers, it started to become this process of well, hold on, wait, what? I have to justify to the engineers why I'm not using the component. And so then it kind of almost puts a bit of pressure on them to be oh, I probably should have used the component. So it's actually benefited me.
A little extra accountability there.
Yeah. And it benefits me as a maintainer because one of my hardest challenges is convincing people to use the system and to search the system instead of trying to rebuild stuff every time. Here's a great example. I mean, it's quite a straightforward component, this list item. It's a grey box with some text in, and there's maybe some optional bits in there like these icons that can be enabled and disabled. That's not an insane amount of work to build, but it is in the long term when you're doing this over and over and over. So yeah, that's kind of one of the key things that I look for is an engineer that has that mindset. And I think any engineer in a company can start to do that because, if you think about it from your point of view, if you're creating the same kind of component over and over and over again in slightly different ways, there is a fundamental problem somewhere.
Right.
And there's a real opportunity for you to work backwards with your designers to say, hey, we've built a component for this particular list item because we just like to reuse it. It's better for us. How about we sit down and we'll show you how it works and we'll talk you through how you could maybe do it. You don't have to know how to build it in Figma. That's fine. That's their problem. You can let them figure that part out.
Yep.
But just by giving them that map, right? Going back to the to this screen here, you can give them these, in fact, yeah, probably more like this, but you could give them these states, right? You could give them these properties in a really simple format. Don't give them a JSON file because they probably won't make sense of it immediately. But, just listing out, okay, we have this state and this state can be either this, or this. We have a label, that's optional string. You can put whatever you want in there. We have an icon left. That can either be on or off, and it can be any of these icons. I don't know, it depends what you're constructing and how. But I think having those conversations, you start to cement that in the mindset of the designers. Another thing that I've seen at some organizations, which I always think is kind of wild, but also I'm kind of here for it, is engineers that will build a design system without there being any notion of that in the design team. So they'll be constructing using something like Storybook, for example, right?
Yeah.
You build a component in Storybook, you add the Storybook code to your library and submit that stuff and commit
just an entirely
get it in Storybook.
component exclusive kind of design system. Yeah.
So it's not the full system. Again, it's kind of like the dev equivalent of a UI kit where you've just got a bunch of components that you use, but it's a starting point. And if your design team doesn't have that on their side, oh dear.
Yeah.
but B, but there's your opportunity to say, actually, you know what, guys, like, let's sit down, right? We've done all of this already. We've got these reusable elements. This is how they work. And Storybook does a great job of actually exposing things like properties and making it readable. Like,
I love Storybook.
Get that in front of your design team and sit down with them and say, the most important thing is setting a realistic set of targets, right? And we've done the same with our engineers now. Like I said, we've got around 12 full built components that are exactly spot on across all platforms.
Nice.
We've got loads more components. They're just not consistent across all three. And so, like, the way that we've done it is we did an analytical rundown of, like, what's everything that's being used across design. This was the easiest way for us to do it initially. So we did an analysis of all the component usages. Figma makes this actually really easy. And then basically just picked off that list and said, what are the most important ones that we tackle, in what order? We built a list of 12 components and said, let's start from number 1, which is button, and let's just get cracking. And then we just hit, one off at a time until we got to a better place, and then we can do that again and again and again. And so you could do the same thing in reverse, where you look at Storybook and say, cool, we've got loads of buttons. We know all of the states that we're using here. We're clear on, like, all the properties, etc. Let's sit down with our design team, map it out, and let's start constructing it together. And then those less technical designers don't have to understand how they can break it down, because you kind of go into them with the solution. All they need to do is then take that and work out how to construct that in Figma, and that's all good. And if you have designers on your team that don't know how to do that sort of stuff, they can talk to me. They can just get in touch on Twitter, which is, I don't know if I'm pointing at it on my screen, but they can chat to me and I can help. But nice. Yeah, I guess that would be my advice.
Good. So as we are getting close to wrapping up, I do want to open it up. If there's anyone in the chat who may have just joined us, who has been hanging out with us the whole time, if you've got questions you haven't asked about design systems, about developer designer communication, about hybrid careers with design dev, can't speak, about Figma, about component libraries, really anything that we've touched on, fair game. Both of us will do our best at answering them. Throw them in the chat. While we give people a minute to post or not, I also wanted to kind of circle back. There was one question that I had asked you earlier about kind of where kind of designers struggle in terms of understanding the dev side. And we talked about kind of some responsive design struggles and that idea of breaking away from pixel perfection. But I kind of want to flip that question now that we're at the end and we've kind of switched over to the dev side. When you're working with developers, where do you find is the biggest gap that they have in terms of design knowledge, and where, if you could, wave the magic wand and grant them the knowledge to kind of build that bridge, where do they struggle?
Yeah, interesting. I think probably one of the areas that we see most often is going to be around like common spacing, which is super, like, you can codify spacing, obviously you can have tokens for it. But what I think, and I think this will change more as time goes on and kind of tokenizing becomes more prevalent, because it still feels very new. But what we tend to see is there'll be views that have been created. So let's say, for example, going back to what I was saying previously around designers sometimes having like a couple of hours to ship something, that is not an exaggeration. Sometimes things pivot, stuff changes, or a developer needs a view real quick because, like, they're building it out. We're supposed to ship it at the end of the day, and you didn't have this state defined, right? So there's kind of an element around that where designers moving quickly, if they're not comfortable with auto layout and other tools in Figma that help to make like consistent spacing easier, they'll put stuff in that's maybe a pixel out, and you'll have like a 15 pixel padding and on one side and 17 on the other. And it's supposed to be 16, right? Straightforward. Right. And sometimes what we see is that stuff gets codified. And so a developer will think it's intentional. And rather than asking, and sometimes they will, and then we obviously solve the problem, but rather than asking, sometimes that gets coded in. And so then we have this strange override where like every screen is 16:16, gutters left and right. And then suddenly something's 15:17, and we're like, wait, what? And you might not spot it because it's like, when it's built, if you're not looking at it closely, 1 pixel out probably won't be that noticeable. But sometimes that tends to happen. And so there's I guess there's two things. One is, if something doesn't seem right, it's probably not right, and it's probably not intentional. And so I would encourage you to push back on the designer and ask, right? And just say like, hey, this is 15:17. Is that like on purpose?
Sometimes that what you meant?
Is,
yeah.
Right? There's times when I've got I had like a tag component, for example, that's fully rounded, and I offset that by 4 pixels because otherwise, when you line it up perfectly, it doesn't look optically right. And so you do a 12 pixel gutter instead of 16 for that one component because it helps it to line up with everything else. So there's like little things like that, and again, that's another thing that I've seen, to flip it, where I've done it intentionally and it's got coded in incorrectly. And so when I see it coded, I'm like, well, hold on a sec. And it's just all a perfect 16 pixel gutter. And so it doesn't optically sit right.
Right.
So there's like this thing where I think there needs to be a conversation where, and obviously that's where this stream becomes really useful, is enabling developers to feel confident to ask those questions around like, this doesn't feel right to me. Is it intentional or not? And so like things like having a good grid system, both in what you've built and also what your design system or design team are using, is kind of essential there, where you're working on an 8 pixel grid. So if something is not divisible by 8, there's a problem there in some way. If it's divisible by 4, that's probably intentional, right? So like I said, that 12 pixel offset, like that's intentional. And so I do break the grid there, but that's because it needs to look right and feel right.
Right, but even then, you're breaking it in a specific and intentional way that's still within the bounds of the grid. You're breaking it, but not really.
Not too bad, yeah. And obviously, there's also, on the other, from the designer's perspective, there's an opportunity to make sure that you explain that stuff when you share the designs too, right? So there's like a kind of a handing off documentation experience that kind of needs to be in place, but. I think developers having that like knowledge of, hey, we're working against a grid and like we're clear on our divisions. So when something doesn't feel like it sits within that, or it, literally mathematically doesn't, let's question why, or even just have the judgment to say 15:17. That's obviously a mistake. Like I'll just do it 16:16. I'll just fix it. And more often than not, that happens. But I've seen it in the past where the opposite has happened, and it's kind of painful as a designer. You're like.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing. The next biggest thing, if I was to push something out, would be encouraging developers to also get comfortable with like using what you've got. If you've got a good system, there's a missing error state, but you've already done an error state before. Maybe you could throw one together for like the thing that is coming, right? It's like, hey, we've got a 404 state for this web view, but we don't have a 401 state, but we want it. I don't know. I can't remember what a 401 is, but or if it even exists. But anyway, you have like another state. And if you need a view for that, like maybe you can just reuse that stuff that you've used before. And then you can share that with the team, be proactive and come back with that. Hey, I've put this together. What do you think? Because more often than not, if you're using the same components, I reckon a designer's just going to be grateful that they've not had to do the extra random error state that they did that for.
Absolutely, yes.
And I love it. Like I always want, when I'm working with the Cosmic team, our developers come up with design ideas all the time. Like they'll use some random motion library and be like, hey, look, I've done this thing that like, this fades in here and this spins. And I didn't tell him to do that, but I'll be like, hey, that looks wicked. Like, I'm all in. Just, like, let's stick with it.
Nice.
Because it shouldn't, again, design shouldn't be just a designer's job. Like, I think design is the job of the entire team. A designer is just a facilitator of that process a lot of the time.
I really like that phrasing.
Am I devaluing my job?
Facilitator of that process. That was really good. You get that.
You can put that in quote marks and send me some kind of thing I can stick on the wall.
You need it. Yeah, you need like a plaque or at least a sticker.
Put it right behind here for every video call I'm on. Yeah, nice.
But I do think we are just about at our time for today. If people want to find you online, if they want to follow you and what you're working on, where are the best places for them to do that?
So you can go to Elon Musk's Twitter. This underscore KEJK. You can find me there. But also my personal site, so kejk.tech. I do a lot of writing on there. I tend to write about design or development or both at the same time. It's usually a pretty good place to find me, and most links are kind of kicking around there. But yeah, I think that's probably the best place. I don't really use social media that much. I'm kind of...
It's probably for the best.
Yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for being a guest. I really loved this conversation. I had a lot of fun getting to chat with you about all your process and everything you do. Thanks for all of our viewers who tuned in. It was great to see y'all. And we will be here every Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern time, to talk about a new design topic. Sometimes with a guest, sometimes you just get me. It's more fun when we have a guest. But I hope you'll come back and learn a little bit more about design. Hope everyone has a wonderful day. I'll see you guys later.